Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, our sponsors, our community partners, our volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, SAGE, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout the years. My name is Josh Sayles. I'm the Director of Jewish Community and Government Relations for the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. And I'm joined by Shirley Plantin, the Director of the Community Relations Board for Miami-Dade County. And we're so excited to be moderating a virtual conversation together with Shared Legacies Director, Dr. Shari Rogers, and Rabbi Richard Hirsch, a legend in the Jewish civil rights advocacy field and founding director of the Union for Reform Judaism's Religious Action Center. First and foremost, Shari and to the Rabbi, let's start with Shari. Why is the story of the close ties that the Black and Jewish communities had during the civil rights movement still so relevant in today's world? And why did you feel it's such an important story to tell?
Thank you so much. And what an honor to be here in Miami with the Miami Film Festival and Dr. Plantin and Rabbi Hirsch. It's just I'm so humbled, truly. Thank you so much. I think this history is so important. As we're going around the country, most folks 40 years and younger don't even know this history. And it was one of the most important intergroup coalitions in American history that actually helped transform the conscience of America that most folks don't know about. And as we are moving into the 21st century with more diversity, it's important to learn from lessons in history about what went right and what didn't went right. And there was so much about this history that I think was positive that we can learn from today as we're building more and more coalitions.
Rabbi, you were involved in this. You were directly involved in the civil rights movement. You, in fact, as far as I understand, you gave speeches. One in particular comes to mind at a church in Selma, where you were introduced by Dr. Martin Luther King. You had a personal relationship with him. Why is this story so important in your mind to continue to tell all these decades later?
Well, first of all, there's a close relationship between the American Black community and the Jewish community. And it goes back to history. It's no coincidence that the African American community takes its roots in Jewish tradition. There's nothing that's more impactful than the Bible story of the Exodus from Egypt. The Jews were slaves. And slavery is not just a physical act. Slavery is also an emotional, an intellectual, an ideological act. And therefore, the analogy of the African-American problems in our society and in every other society is related to the Bible story. Let my people go. Let my people go is the theme, and that has to be interpreted.
Rabbi, I'd like to ask a question. So at the CRB, we actually have a committee called My Brother's Keepers, and it is actually headed by the very famous Rabbi Schiff, whose sole purpose is really to bring and integrate, issues of violence, issues of tension, race issues, predominantly around anti-Semitic, behaviors. So I guess my question to you, in light of everything that happened last summer, how do we make this correlation that around the same theme of let my people go? So BLM is really asking the same thing, right? So these protests around freedom and wanting to be seen and viewed as with dignity and equity, how would you correlate the story, and why is it still important with what we're living with today?
Well, because first of all, you have to have an intellectual background, an ideological passion to try to recognize that we have to create justice. The Bible says, justice shall pursue. And we have to, so it's very important. It's important because we have to, the Jewish tradition talks about the Takein Olam B'Malchut Shaddai. What is the task of the Jewish people? To correct the world under the image of God. And therefore we have a common challenge and a common responsibility.
Jerry, I want to go back to something that you said, and kind of, you know, the importance of retelling the story for people who are under, you know, 40. And it's, I've worked in the Jewish civil rights space for quite a long time, but I'm personally still in my 30s, and it's a conversation that I have with more senior members of our community in the Jewish community, which is this kind of dichotomy between, well, of course we have the Jewish community and the Black community have great relationships. Look at what we did in the civil rights movement. And my response is, right, but I wasn't alive, and many of the people who I work with weren't alive during the civil rights movement. So kind of, you know, to say this kind of bluntly, and I don't mean it in quite this way, but what have we done for each other lately? How do we move that conversation forward from the 1960s, the 1970s into, you know, where we are now?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, history is important. We have to know that we have, the history has to be known. That's the really vital. So when Dr. Clarence Jones at the beginning of the film says, if the lions don't tell this story, the hunters will get all the credit. We have a lion here. We have Rabbi Hirsch, who literally would make sure that when Dr. Martin Luther King would come to Washington, would have a home, an office, if you will, not a personal office, but he had the open place for him to work with civil rights issues and legislation issues that had to get done with President Johnson. That Dr. King understood that the Jewish community, literally surviving thousands of years of being devalued as a people, and then with the recent complete devaluation in the Holocaust being 30 years prior to the civil rights movement, would be the people in American history that would be able to understand the terrible experience that the Blacks had in America, where they had to hold up a sign, literally, I am a man. The fact that during the 60s, folks had to hold up a sign, I am a man, and you know, going off Shirley's point, still today, there needs to be a sign that is manifested in Black Lives Matter, that we still have to literally, we're not done with this issue. We, you know, even though we had a Black president, we still, you know, the injustices that are continuing in the Black community are still there. And I think it's important for the Jewish folks and the Black folks and for all people to know that they had this historical coalition that was very effective, and that coalitions are important. It's important to form coalitions to achieve this goal. We live in America, and we want to look at partners, and a lot of the folks, the younger 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds that find out about this history, find out it was almost like finding a family member that they didn't know worked together with them. So while it wasn't a perfect coalition, and we had differences then, I mean, you know, our own family members, we have differences. It's important to find what was effective and how we can learn those lessons today.
So I have a follow-up question, Shari, and I guess that question would be, so we know that the younger generation, the under 40s, right, they function on Instagram and all of social media. How do we get this message? Because they're not going to the Jewish Film Festival, right? They're not, this isn't readily available in their face, or at least something that they would go looking for. One, because they don't know it exists, or two, they don't think it matters to them. So how do we get this message? Because like you say, knowledge is power, right? And if they don't know that these coalitions existed, or even the work that Rabbi Hirsch did, so we can't blame them for not knowing. So how is it incumbent upon us to make sure that we get this message out?
Thank you. Well, what we're doing is, first of all, we are building a curriculum, a video curriculum that will be, our film is 96 minutes, but as you know, young people learn in like 5 minutes, 3 minutes. So we are creating 3 to 5 minute videos. We have 80 hours remaining. And Rabbi Hirsch, for instance, we're going to interview as well. But the point is, we're going to have a whole curriculum that teachers are going to be able to augment their American history courses. And we have ambassadors in our own foundation that are working on newsletters. The college universities can offer this film around the country, and they are. And then you build bridges that way. We're going to have our foundation is called Spill the Honey. And the young folks are looking up history, and they're looking at what's going on today around the country that are working in coalitions, in Black Jewish coalitions.
I want to touch upon something that comes up near the end of the movie, and the documentary attributes the beginning of the decline in Black and Jewish relations happened around the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and then Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel died in 1972. And I'm curious, particularly to hear from the rabbi, if Dr. King had lived into old age, do you think that the relationship right now between the Black and the Jewish communities would be different? And if so, how?
I don't know if one individual can shape an entire people and a relationship with different peoples. I know that Martin Luther King, I don't think there would have been a Martin Luther King Day, frankly, had he not been assassinated, because the sad truth is that he was already losing support of his own Black community. Many of the organizations which were part of the Leadership Conference in Civil Rights were already opposed to Martin Luther King because he had entered in 1968, into the opposition of the Vietnam War. And many in the Black community, and even in the white community who were active in civil rights, thought that, why the heck is this guy who was advocating civil rights in America suddenly dealing with foreign policy? I, of course, who was opposed to the Vietnam War, and our organization, which came out publicly, supported him continually. But I think that at Martin Luther King, tragically, I think that's true of many heroes. Their death and the nature of the death immortalizes them. It makes us realize what the real motivation of Martin Luther King was and what the character was. And as I said in the eulogy, which I was privileged to deliver in his memory, he hasn't died. The message is stronger than ever before. And it's a message which encourages us, which motivates us, which propels us to try to solve the problem. And how to do that? That's through legislation, voting. We've demonstrated already in the election of November 2020 what the power of advocates of civil rights is. So I'm encouraging us to use the legislative process and to use the voting act.
I'd like to kind of piggyback on that point, Rabbi. During the civil rights movement, or at least what's taught to us in schools, is that the civil rights movement was predominantly a Black movement, right? And we didn't really see those who were in the background that were supporting that didn't look like the people on the front. And if we compare it to what we're seeing right now, this fight for justice, which really took heed last year, we realized there are so many more people involved in the fight. How do we correlate what happened in the civil rights movement and what we're seeing right now? And I guess it's a two-parted question. Do we see any similarities in the leaderships, right? So there was a Dr. King, and there were so many other leaders that may not have had the same limelight that Dr. King had, but this movement wasn't monolithic. And we're seeing so much of that right now play out. Are there any correlations, and are there any advice that you can give to the leaders of the present movement?
I don't know about advice. I can just say what happened. First of all, it's not true that there were not white people involved in the 60s. As a matter of fact, in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, there were all kinds of groups, all the religious groups, the national religious groups, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, the labor movement. There were many whites. And I was fortunate enough, I had brought into the institution which I directed, I had brought the leadership conference, what then called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, into our building. And I can tell you that all the meetings which took place in our building, there was a wide group of women's groups, labor groups, many or most of them were probably white. And I was very proud of the Jewish participation because the Jewish participation was very knowledgeable. And it so happened that the lawyers who were the strongest advocates, including also, of course, the Black lawyers like Clarence Mitchell and Roy Wilkins. But it was a mixed group. And I don't know, the implication, Shirley, was that today there's greater white participation than in the past. I'm not sure about that.
Rabbi, I want to piggyback on what Shirley asked. She asked about kind of the positive aspects of the civil rights movement. And I want to ask about kind of the negative, the flip side, not of the civil rights movement, but in terms of, racism and anti-Semitism. Towards the end of the film, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson says racism and anti-Semitism come from the same place of bigotry. And I don't think it's hard for us to make the connection present day between the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, or the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the riots in Charlottesville. The different side of, or really the same side of a different coin decades earlier would be, the Birmingham bombing, or, the murder of Cheney and Goodman and Schwerner. Do you see, what are the similarities and the differences that you see between those events today versus what you saw?
I don't know, in all honesty, I've only been back in America. I lived in Israel from 1973 until 4 or 5 years ago. So, and I'm not at the age where I'm a participant in today's activities. What happened in the 1960s, I am knowledgeable about it. And what happened at around 66, 67, with the passage of the legislation, that many of the leaders of organizations like the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Walter Reuther organized the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty, which also had an office in our building, incidentally. And when we planned our first national meeting, the chairman, I forget who the chairman of the meeting was, but it was a white man, and the blacks objected. And in an avalanche, at the opening meeting of the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty, they came in and said, "We're taking over." The blacks correctly did not want to have whites as leaders of their organizations because it was a manifestation of weakness. They had to fight for their own rights. And that's what's happening now. Now, there is some anti-Semitism, and we have to recognize that. And the anti-Semitism is in part because the Jews were so liberal, because the Jews, when they began to leave in the 1950s and 1960s, the center cities, and move into the suburbs, who moved into the Jewish neighborhoods? The blacks. And so the Jews were, in many instances, the slum owners, and in many instances, they were also the owners of the stores. And some of the blacks felt that the stores were exploiting them and so forth. So there were all kinds of reasons why. Number one, the legitimate recognition on the part of blacks that they had to lead their own fight. Legitimate. And number two, that they had to break all kinds of ideas which were negative ideas about blacks. And the way to do that was to live and work together. And that's what we have to do today.
Shari, on that point, we understanding what Rabbi just said, that there were some perceptions, there were some things that needed to change, and they, the Black community had to lead their own fight. But part of what we're realizing today is that we're so interconnected in so many ways that the reality is coalitions, as you were speaking of earlier, makes us stronger. So I know, having been a partner of the Jewish Federation on many different issues, we're realizing now that the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, is understanding the value of the partnerships, right? So the people that are on the front lines it's a rainbow of colors, because we understand the strength in numbers, the power to have other people help us fight this, or better yet, the allies. How do we build upon this? As you were saying about coalitions and how we're all in this together, how do we get that message farther across to those who may not necessarily always see that, because we're so accustomed to fighting the battle on our own?
Well, first of all, I want to say that there are so many Jews of color, Black Jews, that I think are at the forefront of this conversation. And I would like to say, would you help us, Shirley and Josh and Douglas, help us? We have this lion. We have so many lions right now that are living, that we need to have these intergenerational discussions. So let's get on it now. And I think this would only empower our diversity, empower our coalition building, if you use me, use our film, and I can help work with you guys to bring in these younger people so they can ask. This is a giant in our community right in Florida, Rabbi Hirsch. You can see his knowledge is priceless. I mean, Dr. Clarence Jones is 90 years old. He was chosen by Claiborne Carson at Stanford University to represent Dr. King's mind. He understands the importance of coalitions. He understands the connection between how, coalitions don't undermine the very thing that you're looking for: freedom, justice, movement, that, working with the police officers, whatever, the pipeline from high schools to the prison system. While there are different issues today, then there was a very specific issues where Blacks weren't allowed to vote in the 60s. There are issues today that need to be, that we need to get done. So what I'm saying to you is, film is very effective, but we also have these giants that are living now that we need to have these intergenerational discussions. So I'm happy to work with you in making this happen.
Appreciate that, and we would very much welcome that. And Shari, I'll speak on behalf of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation and just say we're looking forward to it, and we'll be in touch. I have your contact information, and we'll be in touch.
Right.
I want to go back. Well, actually, so something the rabbi said, and also Shari, to something you said. The rabbi started talking about when Jewish people started moving out to the suburbs from large cities in the 50s and 60s, and that's how some anti-Semitism from the Black community towards the Jewish community started to manifest itself. And I kind of want to address, and Shari, you do this towards the end of your documentary as well, talk about the divide and some of the anti-Semitic issues that the Jewish community has faced around Israel specifically. To the Jewish community and Jewish community leadership that is concerned about, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement with the claim that there's some anti-Semitism, my response would be, of course there's anti-Semitism in the Black Lives Matter movement from the left. Of course there's anti-Semitism on the right. Of course there's anti-Semitism in Europe. Of course there's anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Of course there's anti-Semitism everywhere. We're Jews. We understand this. This is what we cope with. And so I think that it's our role as Jewish community to fight anti-Semitism by specifically being in coalition with others and letting others get to know us and see who our true values are. But I did want to go back, Shari, and touch on the Israel point, right? I believe you specifically talked about the rallies in Ferguson, and that there were members of the Black community who weren't willing to work with Jewish people who support Israel's right to exist. They see the rights of Jewish people and or Israelis and the rights of Palestinians as binary issues. And I would argue that I think Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, never saw the rights of Black people and white people as binary issues. And I don't think it's fair to, I think it's fair to make the leap that he wouldn't have seen the Israeli and Palestinian conflict as binary either.
Well, first of all, I want to hear how the rabbi, since he lived in Israel, and I think I would like to hear from him what went on in the 60s, because a week before Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered, there was, as you saw in the movie, it was Rabbi Heschel's 60th birthday, and there was a conservative rabbinical celebration for Rabbi Heschel's birthday. And Rabbi Gendler actually had collected questions from 1,000 rabbis that he specifically asked Dr. Martin Luther King about many issues, including some of the issues that Rabbi Hirsch just discussed in terms of some of the difficulties, you know, in living conditions in the urban situation. However, he always talked about the positive, and they did ask him a question about Israel at that particular meeting when Dr. Martin Luther King did say Israel was the beacon of democracy, and that was in 1968. So that was a year after the 1967 war. I don't know, you know, what he would say now, but that's what he said then. But I would be just interested in Rabbi Hirsch talking about Israel.
I talked with Martin Luther King in 68 about Israel, and he was very positive about Israel. It's natural. What happened in response to the issue that you raised, it was natural for far left groups, and not only far left groups, for other groups to be sympathetic with the Palestinian cause. We as Jews are overwhelmingly delighted and positive about the establishment of the State of Israel. The State of Israel restored Jewish peoplehood to the Jewish people. It was understandable how originally those who organized the Black Lives, from what I understand, I was told, from those who organized the Black Lives Matter, they identified with the Palestinian cause and didn't know anything about the Jewish cause. I think that has been corrected, and the groups that are now working with the Black Lives Matter, and it's a vast hodgepodge of people and groups, positively so, it's wonderful. They eliminated those negative sections which were originally in the mandate of the Black Lives Matter group. And I'm familiar with what my people at the Religious Action Center, which as you said, I founded, I'm interested that they are overwhelmingly involved primarily involved in the Black Lives Matter cause now. So I'm very sorry that Martin Luther King is not around now, because there's not a recognized moral voice on this issue. And but we're doing all right, I think, with those who are involved.
My question then would be, how do we transcend the barriers, right? So to Josh's point, there were some negative things, and I think Shari addressed it too. How do we make some things right? So how do we transcend those negativities and really begin to propel forward as one community, understanding that we have shared values, shared history, more importantly, that there are wins for humanity that came based on our partnerships, right? How do we transcend the noise? How do we transcend the misinformation to actually blow up, for lack of a better term, or highlight exactly what I is speaking right now?
It seems to me the way to do that is the ongoing working relationships. And when you work with people and you're committed together with a common cause, you develop a personal interrelationship, and that's a bond which can't be spelled out. You can't spell out how do you become a friend with somebody? How do you become an advocate together? First of all, the person has to have a passion to create a just society. And as far as the Jewish community is concerned, that passion goes back to Passover. We're now in less than a week. We have at the end of this week, we have the Passover holiday, which has become the common symbol for everybody in the world. And we know what it means to be a slave. And if you know what it means to be a slave, one of the famous passages in the Haggadah is, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot et atzmo כאילו hu yatsa miMitzrayim." Get it? Who in every generation, every person should look upon himself as if he had come forth from Egypt. You came forth from Egypt, not your forefathers. You came forth from Egypt. And therefore, you recognize what it means to be a slave.
I want to add, if it's okay, take a couple minutes and just add on to what the rabbi just said in terms of being in relationship with one another and kind of building and strengthening and getting to know each other. Looking at all of the cultural differences between Black people and Jewish people, and also acknowledging that there are Black and Jewish people who hold both cultures very dear. I think even something as simple as our organizational structures, we just don't understand because they're so different. To the Jewish people who are watching this and who are involved in their Jewish community, whether you're involved with your synagogue or your federation or your JCC, all of those boards and those structures are from the top down. And we know that you have your president and your VPs and your secretary, and we know who, and we know who's calling the shots. And when you're looking at, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a huge distinction, I think, between the Black Lives Matter organization, the Movement for Black Lives organizations, the other organizations, and simply just saying Black Lives Matter. And my favorite story, and I'll add that those organizations such as Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives are built from the bottom up in the complete opposite way that Jewish people who are involved in their communities and who care about these issues, it goes against all of their instincts in working in the community. So my favorite story that I'll tell to kind of illustrate this issue is a Black Lives Matter pre-COVID rally on, I want to say, on the Upper East Side. My friend told me this story where she lives on the Upper East Side. She went for a walk and she saw Black Lives Matter. She walked past a Black Lives Matter protest and very quickly realized that there were 3 different protests actually going on by 3 different groups. And when they got together, they realized there was one group that was standard Black Lives Matter organization. There was another one that was, pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. And there was another one that was kind of conservative and anti-LGBT. And these 3 groups who were all together as the police were putting around barricades to kind of keep protesters safe and make sure that they had freedom of speech, these 3 groups realized that they didn't agree with each other and they didn't want to stand with each other. And so within 20 minutes, instead of one Black Lives Matter protest in the Upper East Side, there were 3 different Black Lives Matter protests, all separate from each other, all about very different issues, and yet they all fell under the same umbrella of Black Lives Matter. And I think that that's something that is very foreign to the Jewish community. I know we've been running out of time, and thank you for indulging me and let me kind of go off on that side rant. Shari, do you have any favorite anecdotes before we wrap? Anything that you wanna share in particular? highlights of making this documentary?
Well, I think before Congressman John Lewis passed away, I think it was, he's such an icon for leadership. I hope all the young people get to know him who don't know him. And before he passed away, at the end of our film, he says, we are all living in fear right now, but if he has to believe if Martin Luther King were alive today and Rabbi Joshua Heschel, they would be pulling together for those generations yet unborn. And before he passed away, he did something in legislation. He co-founded a Black Jewish caucus in Congress because he understood there's more. Of course, there's the organizing, but then it has to be connected to legislation. It has to be connected with the government, and you have to form these working coalitions like Rabbi Hirsch did with the Religious Action Center or American Jewish Committee. There's so many, or the NAACP. So, and now there's a Black Jewish caucus in Congress, and hopefully there will be, now that there's Senator Warnock, hopefully there will be a bicameral caucus in the Senate working on Black Jewish relations, because our two communities not only understand, while we're very different communities, we know what it's like to be devalued as a human being and our communities to be devalued as a human being, but we also know what it's like to achieve something together. So it's not just the pain, but we also accomplish something together. So we need to harness that energy. And of course we can look at some of the, some of the negativity that's going on in our own families. It's hard to navigate. I have 3 sons. They're completely different. But however, there is enough justice and there's enough issues today, and I'm reiterating, that we can build important coalitions and get more proximate to each other, and do, and follow certain models like the Religious Action Center or the American Jewish Committee, that are doing amazing work with coalition building and learning from Rabbi Hirsch. Like his, when he talks about Passover, he understands it's not just a history, it wasn't just history, it's the mindset of understanding our own personal obligations as Jewish people. And that doesn't mean all Jewish people follow that, but if they don't learn their history, it's just as important for the Jewish people to be inspired by this coalition and by being inspired why there were so many Jewish people that were involved in the civil rights movement.
Rabbi, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, only that I think we always have to work toward the future. And the Christian community talks about the Messiah. The Jewish community talks about the Messiah. Personally, I don't think he's ever going to come again. But the idea of a messianic age, of an age when everyone will live in peace and brotherhood, is rooted in both Christianity and Judaism. Christianity received it from Judaism. And my view is that the closer you come, as you walk toward the ideal society, you see that the horizon keeps changing. So your concept of what is ideal and what the relationship should be is constantly in flux. And that's the way it should be. I think that the society today, for example, in terms of interracial relationships, is much better. The role that the African-American community is taking is much better. The number of people that are in Congress, the number of people who are in major positions of influence, who are from the African-American community, is far greater than it ever was. The number of intermarriages is increasing. So I think that we're on a hopefully steadily approach to a far better society. But we'll never reach the perfection because we're human beings. But nevertheless, that's our ultimate goal, and that's the objective we should have, those of us who work with both the Black and the Jewish community.
Rabbi, do you have any, I'm just asking you before you get off, do you have any, like a personal story about you and Martin Luther King? I mean, since we have you on, when Martin Luther King maybe introduced you in Selma, I would love to hear that story. I think the community would love to hear that story. In Selma.
what happened was after the events in March, I think it was, of 1965 in Selma, when the blacks tried to have voter registration, and the sheriff had engaged the Ku Klux Klan to to prevent them from not only the Ku Klux Klan but the officers, the white officers. There was prejudice. People were killed around that area, and so I got a call from the head of the National Council of Churches that they had a plane reserved. The very next morning, Martin Luther King asked that clergymen come down, and they had a plane for 15 clergymen. They had already engaged 13 Protestants. They had a Catholic Monsignor, most of whom I knew incidentally. And he said, now we need a rabbi. I said, but I can't come because I'm going to the White House for a meeting on this crisis. They said, well, we need a rabbi. Get us a rabbi. I said, okay, I promise you a rabbi. I called 4 or 5 rabbis. I couldn't find anybody who was willing to go. I called my wife and I said, can I go? And she said, yes, you have to go. So I went, and there were 15 of us. I was the only rabbi. And we got to there, and Martin Luther King was talking. They put me on the pulpit of the Brown's Chapel, and Martin Luther King finished his talk, and he turns to me and he says, Dick, you're on. And so I was totally unprepared, but this shows my attitude toward these issues. So I issued basically 3 thoughts. It took a half hour. I'll tell you why. I issued 3 thoughts. One was, when God created man, this is all from Jewish literature. When God created man, he created only one man. If God knew that he was going to populate the world with billions of people, why not billions of people? And the rabbinic tradition says, so that no man will ever be able to say, my father is better than your father. And the congregation, I love to be in a African-American church, because there's no congregation that's more alive and with the preacher. So they started dancing in that one sentence. They started dancing in the aisles. It took about 10 minutes. And then Martin Luther King, they quieted the crowd. And I gave my second sentence. When God created man, he created man using dust from the 4 corners of the earth. Why? So that no one will ever be able to say, the place from which I come is better than the place from which you come. And again, in the aisles, give him hell, Rabbi, give him hell, and so forth. They quieted down. Then I gave my last sentence. When God created man, he created man using every color of dust. Why? So that no one will ever be able to say the color of my skin is better than the color of your skin. And again, howdy, pandemonium. I gave a few closing remarks, and I consider that to be the greatest talk I ever gave. And I wasn't prepared. It was 3 sentences, what amounted to.
It's beautiful.
What a wonderful story, Rabbi, and thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you, Rabbi, for being here and joining us today. And thank you to Dr. Shari Rogers, and thank you to Shirley Plantin, our partner at the Community Relations Board at Miami-Dade County, for being here with us as well. And especially thank you to all of the film festival's members, our sponsors, our community partners, our volunteers,